a crazy quilt of cultures converged to create the future state of Kansas, following its opening for settlement in 1854. Equally diverse were the people who contributed to the fabric of old Breckenridge County, now Lyon County, in the east central part of Kansas Territory. The original inhabitants, the Indians of the Sac and Fox Reservation on the east part of the county, and the Kaw Reservation, which covered the entire northwest corner of Breckenridge County, contributed to the background fabric. Overstitching all else was the political charge to all Kansans that they would have popular sovereignty in deciding if the state would ever enter the Union as a free state or a slave state. Engineered by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas, the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the floodgates of people of all political persuasions: abolitionists, free soilers, strict constitutionists, pro-slavery advocates, as well as chameleons who changed their colors as the winds of slavery turned. Whatever Kansans decided to do, their vote would upset the balance of slave and free states in Congress. The issue of slavery draped over all counties in Kansas, even a county as far from the border as old Breckenridge County. 1856 was the bloodiest year in the Bleeding Kansas era. Although much of the bloodshed took place in the border counties, Breckenridge County lays claim to being the residence of the only woman killed in the conflict, and she was killed farthest west in the state. David Van Gundy had settled with his family near the junction of the Neosho and the Cottonwood Rivers in 1855.
David Van Gundy was a strict constitutionalist. He believed that it should be handled by the people and the states, the individual states, between slavery or no slavery. He didn't own any slaves, and he never did own slaves. He wasn't against having slaves. He did believe in the Constitution and what it stood for, and that it was for the people to decide. I think it had to have been very, very frightening for his family.
Others who agreed with him lived nearby, and the community had gained a reputation of being pro-slavery for this reason. In August of 1856, he made a trip to Westport for supplies. While there, he befriended a man who in confidence warned Van Gundy that there was an impending abolitionist attack on the settlement in the upper Neosho. A group of abolitionist raiders led by Captain John C. Cook, who would eventually die with John Brown at the raid on the Harper's Ferry Arsenal, attacked the very night that Van Gundy returned home from his trip to the border. The raiders rode from cabin to cabin along the upper Neosho River Valley, warning the settlers that they should leave the area. Upon arriving at the Christian Carver home, the raiders called for Carver to come out. His wife, Sarah Van Gundy Carver, begged him not to go outside, as he was completely unarmed. Tired of waiting, one of the raiders poked his gun through the opening between the logs in the cabin and fired, hitting Sarah as she sat up in bed. The raiders proceeded through the community, skipping David Van Gundy's cabin, warning at every stop that pro-slavers would be killed if they did not leave the area. After visiting most of the cabins, the raiders crossed the river and headed north to Oliver Phillips Inn on the Emporia to Lawrence Road. Here, they spent the night before merging into the Santa Fe Trail and hightailing it for the eastern part of the state. It took Sarah 3 days to die. And following her burial in the Neosho Rapids, 96 wagons of families from the settlement left to seek refuge at Fort Scott. 6 weeks later, 5 wagons returned to their claims and found that new settlers had poured in, jumping their claims and harvesting their gardens and livestock for the winter. The Van Gundy family remained in the county and now live east of Americus and continue to contribute to the patchwork of the county. but have never forgotten their tragic story of 150 years ago. Oliver Phillips Inn still stands on the angling Burlingame Road, which was surveyed by Phillips, the second settler in Lyon County. This inn served as a stop for travelers crossing Duck Creek on their way to their destinations. At one time, Phillips had a large corral filled with horses for fresh mounts for travelers who stopped at his inn. He was also known to have surveyed the town of Emporia. A relative of the owners of the Eldridge Hotel in Lawrence, Phillips continued the family business of providing a hostel for weary travelers in the early days of Kansas Territory. The Santa Fe Road crossed North Lyon County from 1821 through 1880, a national highway for anyone heading from the border of the United States across untamed land to Santa Fe, initially part of Mexico. Just as much trade moved from west to east as it moved from east to west.
That was amazing. 15,000 tons. Took a year for a train of 15 cars a day would carry the same amount that it carried in 6 months on the trail. That's a lot of freight that went down the trail. Then when the trail slowed down is because the railroad had bypassed, and I think 1874 is when the railroad went through Emporia. And so in 65 and 66 and along in there, before 1870 was the biggest years of travel down the trail because a lot of people were moving west.
Here in 1854, Charles Withington, the first settler in Old Breckenridge County, built his cabin along 142-mile creek, where he could service wagons attempting to cross the creek and provide provisions to travelers. Withington saw a good opportunity at this location. Eventually, he built the only toll bridge on the Santa Fe Trail, charging a quarter per wagon. The next creek to the west along the Santa Fe Trail was Bluff Creek. One of the most interesting stories of the early days in Lyon County revolves around the Anderson family, which had their cabin and store on the west side of Bluff Creek. William C. Anderson and his family of 8 immigrated from Missouri in 1857. By 1880, Anderson's second son, William T. Bloody Bill, owned 160 acres next to his father's land and had also made a trip as a freighter on the Santa Fe Trail. With Kansas' entry into the Union as a free state in 1861, spring brought civil war and the fracturing of friendships, families, and alliances all over the country. In North Lyon County, Bill and Jim Anderson, and some cousins with Southern sympathies, plus a neighbor from the next creek west, Rock Creek, formed a party of bushwhackers and raided along the Missouri border for horses and mules to trade along the Santa Fe Trail. They had become adept at disguising horses and selling them sometimes to the original owners at a good profit. That their Rock Creek neighbor, A.I. Baker, would join this group has long been a topic of wonder.
In my opinion, he became somewhat allied with the Anderson family. They lived not that far apart from each other. So he was did a lot of surveying and a lot of that. Even the southern section of the city of Emporia, he did the paperwork, the legal paperwork. He was a very early attorney. He was a partner with Ruggles, and he was later a judge, I believe, in the county and stuff. At one point, as the Civil War was beginning and the turmoil, he had joined the local militia in Council Grove, which was pro-Union. And then it appears that his wife died. All of a sudden he runs off and he's offered some type of thing with General Price and the Confederacy. He was quite a tradesman and a merchant and etc. And war brings havoc to that enterprise.
He promised to eventually clear up the strange and mysterious stories around his activity in Missouri, but other events prohibited this revelation.
When he returned, he started dating one of the Anderson sisters, and she was quite young. There's some indication that maybe she might have been with child or whatever, but the indication was the Andersons were quite excited that if they married into the Baker family, their families merged, then it would raise their socioeconomic status. But then all of a sudden he sort of jilts this girl and he marries the local school teacher, who is an older woman of I think 16 or 15 or something, you know, and the Andersons sort of decide they're going to get even with him, and they steal her father's horses and head west with them. And of course Baker was the judge, so he put out a warrant for the Anderson boys for their arrest. The old man Anderson came into the house and he grabbed a shotgun, and evidently it was maybe Sewell's shotgun, which maybe wasn't loaded or whatever, and Baker came down to the landing and killed him. The Andersons fled, the boys fled along with their sisters, and sort of pledged that they were going to come back and get him. On, I believe it was July 3rd, 1862, they came back. There's some indication maybe Quantrell was with them, came ahead and said he was with a wagon train and he wanted to get some liquor from the store and purchase some, and Baker and his brother-in-law, who was 14, went over and started going down in the cellar to get it. They turned around and there was Jim and Bill Anderson, and they hit Baker. Baker fired back and shot Jim. I believe it was in the leg. I'm not sure, I don't remember which one it was, but they then closed it, put a hogshead of grain on it, and set fire to the building. The brother-in-law escaped through a cellar window, and his testimony as to what happened, he hid in the Rock Creek, and when they found him the next morning, he testified as to what happened, but then he died shortly after that. But the Andersons' then career was made of that. Later, I know Bill Anderson wrote a letter to an editor where he claimed that all the killing and later that he became responsible for all started because of what happened to his sister, in turn his father. It just puts all the blame sort of back on Baker as causing that.
After murdering Baker and setting fire to his home, the Andersons rode to Withington's store at 142 Mile Creek, where they bragged of their deeds, pistol-whipped Withington, and stole horses which they rode to the next stage stop. There they repeated their acts, obtaining fresh mounts to ride hard to the next stop, and gaining Missouri in only a few hours' time. With Baker's death, the last promoter of northwest Lyon County was gone, and Emporia assumed leadership of the county for good. Through all of this, the Kaw Indians were experiencing constant encroachment on their lands. Whites were preempting land on the reservation with the expectation that the Kaws would soon be removed to Oklahoma.
But you have scores of people who have settled on the diminished reserve. And it's become a problem. As a matter of fact, when the delegation of Kaw chiefs headed up by Hardheart went to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Indian Commissioner Denver in 1857, that was one of the main items on their agenda. And they are railing about the illegal white settlements and how difficult it's become for them. The lawlessness that pervaded the Kansas landscape had spillover effect in terms of horse thieving, for instance. That same delegation in 1857 complained about how many horses had been stolen by white people. In 1862, the government constructed 138 stone huts for the Kansa. The head of each lodge was given one of these huts, and 40 acres adjoining it with the expectation then that they would farm the adjoining land. In 1863, the agent, a fellow by the name of Hiram Farnsworth, reported that 110 of the lodges were being lived in. Between 1865 and 67, but particularly the second winter when the Kaws were out on their bison hunt. This time the whites came on to the diminished reservation and took out the doors and windows of the huts. And there is the Indians had a council once they got back from their bison hunt, in which they bitterly complained that they no longer had a place to live.
With the removal of the Kaw to a reservation in Oklahoma in 1872, the land on the northwest part of the county became legally open for settlement. The fabric of Lyon County would change forever. Just as the county was changing, the state and the nation experienced tremendous immigration of peoples from the east to the west, from south to north. Following the Civil War, federal troops remained in the South during the period of Reconstruction. Black freedmen trusted that they would gain their rights of free men everywhere: the right to vote, the right to education, the right to land ownership. But following the removal of federal troops in 1877, the South entered a phase known as redemption. White Southerners sought to regain the control over blacks that they had known before the Civil War. In short order, blacks lost hope of a new and brighter future in the South. They resisted beatings, exhibiting independence and fearlessness, and showed that they understood that they wanted to do for themselves and act in their own interests. Farming one's own land meant being one's own master. Southern determination that blacks must not own farmland at any cost matched the freed people's desire to own it. By the winter of 1878 through 1879, word passed quickly among blacks of the exodus to Kansas, the promised land articulated by John Brown. Benjamin Pap Singleton, a self-styled organizer, proclaimed Kansas to be the new Zion, a place of freedom from slavery, a place of land ownership, and civil rights. Singleton scouted the Dunlap uplands in the mid-1870s, but he may have misjudged its erratic climate. Averaging 33.59 inches of rainfall a year, this amount seemed adequate, but rainy Junes may be followed by a long summer drought. In addition, thin soils and rocky hillsides favored stock raising rather than farming. However, in May of 1878, Singleton and about 200 black settlers moved to the Dunlap vicinity. Since the best land had been taken immediately after the Kaw Indians had left, what land remained to be settled was upland. The Great Exodus of 1879 was promoted by Singleton, who distributed circulars to thousands of Southern blacks promoting sunny Kansas. Rumors spread promising every freedman $500, 40 acres, and a mule, first-class hotels on their journey, and apples as big as grapefruits. That summer, more than 20,000 exodusters migrated to various parts of Kansas. Reverend John M. Snodgrass of the Presbyterian Synod of North America was appointed missionary to the colored people of Dunlap, Kansas. He opened the Freedmen's Academy of Kansas, known locally as the Colored Academy, in 1880. In 1882, the Academy served 90 male and 85 female students, of whom 45 were listed as ex-slaves.
Yes, I think most of them came out of Tennessee and the Carolinas, I believe. The stories I heard was just that my grandmother taught there. My aunt, Hattie Davis, substituted and taught there before she went to Manhattan to teach. And I knew some people that attended it, I guess they just wanted their freedom, kind of. That's what I believe, that they wanted their freedom. Even though Lincoln said it was free, you know it wasn't true. You know, slavery was still very prominent back in that day.
School District 40 in Dunlap was divided, with white students attending the schoolhouse of the district and the black students attending a room in the academy building. Black families experienced poor crops and difficulties farming the uplands in 1881. As happened throughout rural Kansas, citizens both black and white gradually left the farm and moved to the cities. Black children began attending integrated schools in Dunlap during the Depression.
And from stories I hear, when my mother went to high school and everything, they was about the same as when I went to high school. We all mingled. The ones that segregated against us, we didn't mingle with. They didn't mingle with us, and we didn't mingle with them. And the ones that didn't, we just all kind of grew up. It wasn't a big thing. They talk about it was a lot of segregation, but there was a lot of integration. It's another interesting thing about Dunlap. We did have a little downtown. I think we had 3 filling stations. We had a hardware. We had a grocery store. We had a bank. We had a post office. They had a barber shop. They had a lumber yard. You know, we had 2 cafes. Oh, and a pool hall. And then we had the city hall. We had a Methodist church, AME, American Afro, and then they had a Baptist church.
2 black churches remained open in Dunlap until the early 1950s, but each was supported only by a handful of families. While establishing a black farming community in Kansas ultimately failed, it was a success in allowing individual black families to escape poverty of the South and overcrowding of big cities. It established an enduring social and economic network that enabled many generations of family members to live, work, and travel throughout the state. The wide and varying history of North Lyon County stands as a testament to the tenacious nature of its early inhabitants. Its involvement in one of the most tumultuous times in Kansas history reminds us of the best and worst of human ingenuity and frailty. Hard times were lived by those who were on the front lines of the bleeding Kansas era, while great gains were made in settling an untamed territory. There were those who would lose along the way. But this is not the end of the story. History is being made today that will shape the future of North Lyon County and add more patches to the crazy quilt that is sure to add to its texture, color, and diversity. Preserving the past for future generations is the stitching that brings context to those who seek to understand the early history of Kansas.